At 61, Johnny Depp finally confronts the secret Hollywood has tried to bury for 4 decades. Sitting alone in a silent room, he removes the mask that once protected him but slowly destroyed him. This is the moment he reveals the darker truth the world was never meant to hear. Hollywood never rewards honesty. Johnny Depp said it without hesitation, as if the sentence had lived inside him for years, waiting for a moment when he no longer feared the consequences. In his world, truth was not currency. Pain was. And the machine knew exactly how to extract it, reshape it, and sell it back to an audience hungry for myth. Behind every premiere, every flash of a camera, every headline that crowned him the newest rebel of American cinema, there was a man quietly unraveling. From the outside, the 1990s looked like the decade when Depp became untouchable. His name lit up marquees, his face covered magazines, and directors competed for his presence. But inside, that decade felt like a slow collapse. Success came quickly, loudly, overwhelmingly, but fulfillment never came at all. The more Hollywood celebrated him, the deeper the emptiness grew, like applause echoing into a hollow room. How do you stay whole in an industry that only wants the pieces of you it can sell? He admitted that the roles he accepted during those years meant nothing to him. Studio films, franchises, projects polished to perfection but starved of soul. He performed, he smiled, he cooperated, but the artistic hunger that once defined him was being smothered. Every set felt colder. Every meeting felt rehearsed. And every time the spotlight hit him, he felt himself dimming under it. If the world believed he was rising, why did he feel himself sinking? It was in this contradiction that the first cracks began to show. Depp described nights where he would return to a hotel room after a press tour, sit on the edge of the bed, and stare at the wall for hours, too exhausted to feel, too numb to cry. The silence that followed fame was the most dangerous kind. No one warns you that applause can drown you louder than criticism. And no one tells you what to do when you become the product instead of the person. That was when substances stopped being a temptation and became a necessity. Not for pleasure, but for survival. I wasn't partying, he confessed. I was trying to breathe. The world labeled him rebellious. The tabloids called him self-destructive. But none of them understood the truth. It is impossible to stay sober in an industry that demands you be 2 people at once, the myth for the public, and the ghost for yourself. How long can a man suffocate behind his own legend before he finally breaks? Even in moments of triumph, Depp felt like an outsider wandering through his own life. He spoke of walking into studio boardrooms, surrounded by executives who praised his brilliance yet never truly saw him. He described film sets where everyone seemed connected except him, as if he were drifting through a party he wasn't invited to. Crowds screamed his name, but the noise only sharpened the loneliness. What good is global admiration when you can't recognize the person being admired? During award seasons, red carpets, and extravagant events, Depp often found himself scanning the room, searching for something real, an honest conversation, a moment of truth, a glimpse of authenticity. But Hollywood trades in illusion, not intimacy. And every time he played along, every time he posed for a camera or signed a contract he didn't believe in, he felt another piece of himself slipping away. At what point does playing a role become living it? By the late 90s, the distance between who he was and who he pretended to be had grown unbearable. Depp moved through his life as though watching himself from afar, disconnected from the men the world called iconic. One part of him wanted to disappear into the characters he played. The other part was terrified he already had. Which version would survive if he stopped performing, Johnny the actor, or Johnny the man? His story in Hollywood was never just about movies. It was about sacrifice, distortion, and a slow erosion of identity masked as success. He lived inside a world that sold fantasy but demanded flesh. And as the decade closed, one question lingered like a shadow he couldn't outrun. How do you escape a prison that looks exactly like your dream? The irony of Johnny Depp's career is that the very characters that made him a legend were the same ones that slowly consumed him. Hollywood praised his genius for disappearing into bizarre, fragile, wounded souls, but few understood why he gravitated toward them in the first place. These roles weren't choices. They were confessions disguised as performances. And every time he stepped into a new persona, he was stepping further away from himself. How could anyone survive that kind of creative exile? Edward Scissorhands was the first doorway. To audiences, he was enchanting, a tragic figure with blades for hands and a heart too gentle for the world. But to Depp, that character was an echo of his own childhood, misunderstood, cautious, afraid to touch life in case he broke it. He said playing Edward felt like bleeding on screen without ever having to explain the wound. The world called it acting. Depp knew it was a warning. How do you heal when the role mirrors the part of you that never did? The pattern deepened with Ichabod Crane, the awkward, trembling outsider lost in a world that demanded more courage than he felt he possessed. The set was dark. The tone was gothic. But Depp admitted that what frightened him most wasn't the headless horseman, it was how naturally he slipped into a man ruled by fear. Was he performing fear, or finally allowing himself to feel it? Then came Hunter S. Thompson, a role that required a descent into chaos so complete it felt less like acting and more like surrender. Depp lived with Thompson, absorbed him, mirrored him until the line between the writer's madness and his own became nearly indistinguishable. The critics called it transformative. But what kind of transformation occurs when the character amplifies your most destructive impulses? And who was left in control, Depp or the persona he had invited into his bloodstream? When Jack Sparrow arrived, everything changed. The world celebrated a pirate. Depp saw a shield. Sparrow was everything he needed to be, unpredictable, theatrical, untouchable. A man who revealed nothing while pretending to reveal everything. A mirror ball, Depp once described him. Reflecting light in every direction so no one sees what's underneath. Sparrow saved his career but deepened his prison. Behind the charm and swagger was a man terrified that the audience loved the performance more than the person performing it. What happens when the mask becomes more famous than the face? With each role, Depp drifted further from the boy who once dreamed of making honest art. The characters were not merely performances, they became armor, costumes he never fully removed. He found comfort in becoming people who weren't him. People whose pain had a script, whose chaos had a director, whose endings could be rewritten. Real life offered no such luxury. How long can someone hide inside fiction before reality demands a price? Off-screen, those roles created a strange tension in his personal life. Friends saw him change, becoming quieter, more fragmented, as if pieces of those characters clung to him long after filming ended. His children saw a father who loved them deeply but often moved like a man walking through fog, present yet distant, warm yet unreachable. What do children do when their father is there but not entirely there? Even at the height of his fame, Depp confessed that he sometimes feared he was becoming nothing more than a collage of the personas he had played, stitched together by expectation and escape rather than truth. Hollywood adored the characters. But who adored the men underneath? And more importantly, did he even know who that man was anymore? His greatest performances were lifelines, yes. But lifelines can tangle. And as Depp looked back at the characters that saved him on screen, he finally confronted the question he had been avoiding for decades. If every role reflected a piece of his suffering, what would happen when the roles ended, and the suffering remained? For all the chaos, all the headlines, all the characters he disappeared into, nothing wounded Johnny Depp more deeply than the quiet moments when he realized what his fame had cost his children. Lily Rose and Jack were the only two people he wanted to protect from the world, but they became the ones most exposed to its cruelty. How does a father reconcile that kind of contradiction? Depp spoke of birthdays he missed, milestones he wasn't there for, school events where his empty seat said more than any tabloid ever could. He remembered returning home from film sets after months away, unsure whether he was stepping back into their lives as a father or as the fractured man the world had portrayed. The guilt was sharp, unspoken, and relentless. How do you look your children in the eye when you know they've paid the price for battles they never chose? He said the most painful moments were the mornings when he would see their names dragged into headlines meant to destroy him. They never asked for fame, never asked for spotlight, never asked to share a last name that could be twisted into a weapon. Depp carried that burden not as a celebrity, but as a father painfully aware that love sometimes isn't enough to shield the people who matter most. What kind of armor can protect innocence from a storm centered around the men meant to keep them safe? But the truth is, this guilt didn't begin in Hollywood. It started long before he was famous, rooted in a childhood marked by volatility, confusion, and wounded silence. Depp rarely speaks about those early years, but when he does, the softness in his voice gives way to something rawer. He remembers nights filled with shouting, slammed doors, unpredictable moods. A house where fear lived in every shadow and love had to survive in the cracks between explosions. How does a child learn trust in a home where footsteps in the hallway can mean danger? He explained that the human heart becomes conditioned by what it grows up with. Chaos becomes familiar. Pain becomes routine. And when he entered adulthood, he didn't run from dysfunction, he walked toward it instinctively, like returning to a language he never truly unlearned. This, he realized, was why he endured toxic environments longer than he should have, why he gravitated toward roles that mirrored wounded souls, why he often felt more comfortable inside fiction than reality. How do you escape patterns that feel like home? Those childhood scars carried into fatherhood in ways he never intended. Depp wanted to be present, nurturing, patient, the father he wished he'd had. But the ghosts of his upbringing haunted him, pulling him into cycles of self-doubt and emotional withdrawal. His children saw the love, but they also saw the weight he carried, the men trying to be strong while quietly afraid of repeating history. Is it possible to raise children without passing down the shadows you've never fully outrun? In the interview, he described a moment, small, almost ordinary, when he realized the depth of his regret. He stood outside his daughter's room, hearing her laugh at something on the phone, and for a second, he froze. Not because of the sound, but because he wondered how many laughs he had missed while pretending to be strong for a world that misunderstood him. How many pieces of their childhood slipped through his fingers while he tried to stitch together the remnants of his own. And yet, the pain wasn't hopeless. Depp acknowledged the brokenness, but he also recognized the courage it took to confront it. For the first time, he was no longer avoiding the truth. He was facing it, allowing the child he once was to meet the father he was trying to become. The question that lingered, the one he still didn't fully know how to answer, was simple but devastating. Can a man heal himself fast enough to become the father his children deserved all along? There comes a moment in every unraveling when the world stops applauding and starts watching. For Johnny Depp, that moment arrived not with a single event, but with a series of fractures, public, private, and devastatingly personal. The fall wasn't sudden. It was slow, methodical, and merciless, unfolding under a spotlight that refused to blink. How does a man survive when the world wants his tragedy more than his truth? The lawsuits, accusations, and tabloid wars turned his life into a spectacle. Every headline became ammunition. Every rumor became a verdict. Depp no longer recognized the men they were tearing apart, yet he had to watch the dismantling in real time, unable to stop it. He described the experience as being buried alive while still breathing. How do you defend yourself when the trial begins long before the evidence? Friends watched him deteriorate, sleeping less, speaking less, retreating into a silence so heavy it felt like another form of prison. He would walk into rooms and sense conversations stop. People studied him not with admiration, but with calculation. Was he broken? Was he dangerous? Was he still profitable? Hollywood loves a legend, but it loves a downfall even more. What happens to a man when an industry decides he is easier to exploit than to believe? The professional consequences came quietly. Calls stopped. Offers vanished. Studios distanced themselves without a word, erasing decades of collaboration with a few carefully worded statements about rebranding and risk management. Depp didn't shout. He didn't plead. He simply understood, a machine cannot love what it builds. It can only swallow it when the narrative demands it. How many careers have been sacrificed to protect a system built on fear? Yet amid the devastation, something unexpected occurred, the war inside him intensified. Depp realized he wasn't just fighting Hollywood, or the media, or the courtroom. He was fighting the version of himself he had carried for too long, the myth, the mask, the man built from characters instead of truth. He had spent years trying to prove something, that he was strong, that he was untouchable, that he could survive anything. But the facade was cracking. And behind it stood someone exhausted by pretending. When a persona collapses, what remains? In the darkest period, when the noise outside was deafening and the silence at home was even worse, Depp found a strange kind of salvation in the letters from fans. Drawings. Poems. Words from strangers who believed in him when the world had condemned him. He kept them stacked in boxes, scattering them across tables, rereading them on nights when he doubted his own reflection. These weren't fan messages, they were lifelines. Why did strangers see the humanity that Hollywood had forgotten? One letter in particular stayed with him. A young woman wrote, "Your character saved me during my worst years. I hope someone saves you. Depp said he stared at that sentence for hours, realizing that for the first time in a long time, someone wished him healing rather than entertainment. In a world that consumed him, a stranger offered compassion. Can a single sentence rebuild a man who has been dismantled piece by piece? As the legal battles intensified, Depp made a decision that stunned many but surprised no one who understood him. He stepped away, not in anger, not in defeat, but in clarity. He no longer wanted to fight for a seat at a table that had never welcomed his truth. Hollywood had been a home, a battlefield, a cage. Now, he was ready to walk out of it. What use is a kingdom if the crown costs your soul? His exit wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, almost gentle. The kind of silence that signals not surrender, but rebirth. And as he stepped back from the world that both made him and nearly destroyed him, one question remained suspended in the air like a final breath before revelation. When a man stops chasing the world's approval, what, and who, does he finally become? When the world fell silent, Johnny Depp discovered something he had never truly experienced before, himself. No cameras. No scripts. No characters waiting to be inhabited. At first, the quiet felt hostile, almost frightening, as if the absence of noise exposed every fracture he had spent decades ignoring. Silence, for a man who lived through storms, can be the most unbearable sound. What happens when the chaos disappears and the only voice left is your own? During the pandemic, the days stretched in a strange stillness, unfamiliar and disorienting. Depp admitted he felt like a man in withdrawal, not from substances, but from identity. For the first time in nearly 40 years, no one was asking him to be Johnny Depp. No one needed the myth, the eccentric, the performer. He woke up to empty schedules and long shadows. At first, he didn't know whether this was freedom or punishment. Was he being forgotten, or finally allowed to breathe? And then, quietly, something shifted. He picked up a paintbrush. Painting began as a distraction, a way to quiet the intrusive thoughts. But slowly, it became a language, one he had forgotten he knew. Hours slipped away as he stood before blank canvases, blues records humming in the background, the soft rhythm of rain tapping against the windows. His strokes were uneven at first, almost hesitant, like someone learning to speak again. But as colors layered, something in him softened. Was he painting memories, or trying to rewrite them? His portraits revealed not celebrities, but anchors, people who had touched his life, people he trusted, people who reminded him of who he was before fame blurred the edges. Each face carried a story, a wound, a truth. Painting his mother was the hardest. He said the canvas forced him to confront love and grief at the same time, a collision that left him breathless. How do you paint someone who shaped your scars? Music returned next, not as performance, but as refuge. Late-night jam sessions with old friends, melodies played softly in dim rooms, songs he wrote but never released. He described these nights as moments when time stopped judging him. Music didn't ask for perfection, it asked for presence. It reminded him of the boy who once played in a garage without caring who listened. Had that boy survived beneath the rubble of fame all along? The more he embraced solitude, the more he realized how little space he had ever given himself to simply exist. He journaled. He wrote letters he never sent. He reached out to people he had lost along the way. There were apologies, confessions, moments of clarity. The quiet that once threatened to swallow him began to rebuild him, slowly, tenderly, deliberately. Can a man be rebuilt from the inside out? In this stillness, Depp redefined aging. He had spent years fearing irrelevance, imagining himself fading into the background of the industry that once celebrated him. But somewhere in the quiet, he discovered a truth far more liberating. Aging wasn't disappearance, it was revelation. You stop caring about the mask, he said. You start valuing the face underneath. What use is immortality if it costs authenticity? He no longer chased roles designed to resurrect a myth. He chose stories that felt honest, art that nourished him, people who spoke to him without agenda. Whether painting in a sunlit room, writing lyrics past midnight, or laughing with his children, Depp found moments that reminded him he was still capable of joy, real joy, not the fabricated kind Hollywood demands for publicity. Could this be the version of himself he had been searching for all along? The man who once drowned in noise was now learning to live in quiet. And as he pieced his life back together through color, melody, and stillness, one truth became impossible to ignore. If silence could heal him, what else might it reveal? In every redemption story, there comes a moment when the battle stops being external. For Johnny Depp, that moment arrived quietly, without applause, without spectacle. It came in the form of a realization, subtle, disarming, and more painful than any headline he had ever endured. The person he needed forgiveness from the most was himself. How do you forgive a version of you that you've spent decades running from? For years, Depp carried shame like armor. Shame for the chaos around him. Shame for the versions of himself distorted by tabloids. Shame for allowing Hollywood to shape him into a symbol instead of a man. He believed the shame protected him, kept him cautious, kept him alive. But slowly, he began to understand a harsher truth: armor can suffocate just as easily as it shields. What happens when protection becomes imprisonment? His journey toward forgiveness didn't begin with a grand revelation. It began with small, almost invisible acts of kindness: waking up without self-punishment, sitting quietly with a cup of coffee, allowing himself to create without judgment, spending evenings with his children without the weight of guilt crushing him. These were ordinary moments, but for a man who lived under extraordinary pressure, they were revolutionary. Can healing begin in the places we once overlooked? As he reflected on the wreckage he had survived, scandal, heartbreak, public trials, he spoke not from bitterness but from clarity. Depp no longer viewed his past through the lens of failure. Instead, he saw a man who did his best with tools he barely knew how to use. He was lost, Depp said, speaking of his younger self, but he fought. It was the first time he allowed himself compassion. Can a man truly move forward without extending grace to who he once was? He also examined the people who hurt him, those who betrayed him, used him, misrepresented him. Surprisingly, there was no venom in his voice. Just exhaustion. And beneath that, a quiet release. He realized the anger he carried was never aimed at them, it was aimed at himself for letting their voices matter. Now, he was ready to set them down, not out of mercy, but out of necessity. How much weight can a single heart carry before it breaks? This shift changed everything: his art, his relationships, his silence. He no longer sought validation from Hollywood or the public. He no longer needed the world to rewrite his story. He had already started rewriting it himself, gently, honestly, deliberately. He chose solitude without loneliness, creativity without performance, connection without fear. For the first time, Johnny Depp wasn't constructing a persona. He was recovering a person. What does a man become when he no longer hides? There was a moment, simple but profound, that symbolized this transformation. Depp stood in front of a mirror, expecting to feel the familiar resentment toward the reflection staring back at him. Instead, he felt something unexpected: recognition. Not of the actor. Not of the scandal. But of the man who had survived. The man who was still here. And for the first time in decades, he didn't look away. Can acceptance be more powerful than absolution? He no longer chased the idea of redemption as Hollywood defines it: box office returns, triumphant comebacks, applause. Depp understood that the real victory was quieter: waking up without regret, going to bed without fear, and living each day without pretending to be someone he wasn't. Being human, he realized, was enough. The final evolution was the simplest yet the most profound: he stopped fighting himself. And in that surrender, he found peace, not the cinematic kind, but the fragile, personal peace that comes from understanding your own scars without letting them define you. But as one chapter closes, another looms in the shadows, waiting for him, and for us, to confront. Because after surviving the world's judgment and his own, one question now rises above all others. What will Johnny Depp choose to become, now that he finally belongs to himself?